my
welcome and good
phone.
evening here in the Philippines, and good morning or good afternoon in Iris. So I'm so grateful to have you, Father Braden McManus, SJ, here with me tonight to share your wisdom, your knowledge about your life experience, a personal encounter with God. That weeks will help me to know you, especially help me also to encounter God in my own life too, and other people lives too. So once again, good evening and thank you for your time to share with me, Father.
Oh, thank you very much. It's lovely to be here and to reconnect. And obviously, I was in the Philippines a few weeks ago, so we met there, and it was a real privilege just to be part of that, part of the theology faculty, and to meet everyone and to get a sense of what the Philippines is about. I was very impressed.
So Father, may I ask you to make a self introduction and your name, your currently mission nowadays, Father.
Absolutely. So, yeah, my name is Father Brendan McManus. I'm a Jesuit priest, but obviously behind that is a very Irish thing. There's always a story, you know. So my story is I was brought up on a farm. My father had a farm. My mother was a school teacher, and I worked on the farm as a kid and growing up. And then unfortunately my father died when I was 19. I just finished school, so I had to run the farm for 2 years, my first job. Then my next brother took over the farm, and I went to university, studied psychology, and then information technology. And then I worked in the computer industry for about 5 years. And then I joined the Jesuits at the age of 30, with this experience behind me. And it was great to come across the Jesuits, having worked in the kind of capitalist consumer society. And so since then, obviously, the Jesuit formation, but I've been working in spiritual direction is probably my thing, and retreats, giving retreats. And I'm also a writer. So I've written about 13 books on different topics, mainly Ignatian spirituality and the Camino. And normally I work on the Camino as a volunteer each summer, debriefing pilgrims. And I walk the Camino quite a few times, and I bring groups on the Camino or on pilgrimage in Ireland. So that's probably enough for now, just a rough idea.
Yeah. Yes, Father. Thank you very much. So tonight I want to touch a bit about your book, which is on the topic of how to find God in the mess. So can you describe a bit what makes you to come up with this topic that finding God in the mess? Is there a story behind that, Father?
Absolutely. There's always a story. But yeah, it's a really interesting story. The story is, I mean, I'd written one book on the Camino
Mhm.
when I had done the Camino 2011. My brother had died tragically, and I had walked the Camino for him. And I wrote this book, Redemption Road, and it became really famous. It was a bestseller. And then I worked in suicide bereavement for a number of years. Because of the book, it kind of launched me into this new ministry. It was really rewarding, and I did loads of things, met lots of groups, but I was getting a bit burnt out. So I went back on the Camino again just to kind of recover myself and get back to some kind of balance. And I went on the Ignatian Camino, the Jesuit Camino, which goes from Loyola to Manresa. It's a special route, and it goes the opposite direction to Santiago. But while I was on that Camino, the second day, I fell in the morning, like I was taking a shortcut. I was probably still a bit, burned out or not really concentrating, not really focused. And I had an accident. I stepped off the side of the road. It was dark, and I had quite a fall on one knee with the backpack, and I didn't realize it at the time, but I had fractured my kneecap, in the fall. So I went to a health center, limped over, and they checked me out and bandaged me up and did everything except take an X-ray, and they told me I could keep walking, and give me some painkillers. So I was walking, and I'm still in a bit of pain, obviously. So a few days later, went back to another doctor and they said there's definitely something wrong. And they checked me out again and said, "Look, you're fine. Keep walking. Take a few painkillers, you know." And eventually, I had to abandon the Camino because obviously it was in a bit of pain and I wasn't sure what it was. So I went back home, and eventually, a long story, but I went to the hospital, the emergency ward, and they did an X-ray, and I saw there was a crack in the kneecap. So I had to go into a cast. My leg had to be in a full leg cast. So I was laid up at home in the in the bedroom, hardly able to move with the leg, and it was one of those old Victorian houses in Ireland. So I couldn't get down the stairs. I was kind of trapped in my room. The funny thing is, this is really like Ignatius Loyola, the experience of recuperation, where he got a lot of insight. So for me, I started to get a lot of insights around. I think I was overstretching myself, and the suicide bereavement work was the key thing, and I had to step back from that work. It was a real helpful insight, but also I was on Facebook. You know the way I have a whole lot of friends, and I was just looking at things, and I saw this guy that I knew from Belfast, which is in the north where I was based, and he was posting poems and reflections, and I thought, God, that looks really good. I thought it'd be great to do something with him, his poems, reflections, and some of my Ignatian spirituality and some of my photographs, as it turns out. So eventually we got together and we started working on this book, which was to become Finding God in the Mess. And we were just doing stories about, people's lives and dealing with hard issues, tough issues like, suicide, like anger, depression, feeling blue, things not going my way. And so it was trying to tackle these ordinary human issues, people in difficult situations. And the funny thing is, originally we couldn't find a good title for the book. Originally, it was called Meditations for Mud, you know, messy meditations. And eventually, the editor in the publishing house in Dublin came up with this really snappy title, Finding God in the Mess. And that was just the perfect title. And that title has pretty much sold the book for us. It's such an intriguing title, and it's a bit of a paradox in the sense it's the opposite of what you expect. A lot of people think I have to be perfect to come to God, or God's not going to be with me. I'm just a bit of a mess, and things are not going well. But in fact, the opposite is true. Obviously, that God is always with us, and especially in these times of the mess. So, that was our big insight, and the book turned out to be really popular and became a bestseller in the publishing house, the bestseller in the whole all the books that they had, and we were amazed, taken aback. It was so successful. It was such a simple book, simple idea, and say with some photographs. Normally, we would have a photograph, a story, about that particular issue, about anger, for example, and then we would have a number of reflection questions just to help people reflect on their own lives, and then some space they could write some notes if they wanted. So really practical book, very small, very adaptable. People could carry it around with them and everything. So, and then eventually we decided it was so successful. We decided we would do a follow up, and the follow up was called Deeper into the Mess. The same formula, just trying to help people in other situations, similar kind of difficult human situations. And then eventually we come up with a third book called Emerging from the Mess. That so it's a trilogy of books based around that one theme. And again, we used to give retreats based on that the theme, finding God in the mess, and they became really popular, and we traveled around the country giving those as well. So that's the rough background, the story behind the book.
So, Father, earlier you mentioned about in your Camino, so you found a lot of inspirations. Can you mention some what inspiration that you get from your Camino, Father?
Yeah, so obviously I've been a big Camino fan, and I've done it about 8 times maybe, but the first one. was the most important one. As a Jesuit in training, and you probably know this yourself, you have to do a number of different experiences, and one of them is a pilgrimage experience. So we were in Spain doing what was to become the Ignatian Camino, walking from Loyola to Manresa in the footsteps of Saint Ignatius. And that for me was a really powerful experience of God. And the irony is, this is a very similar story, but after about a week, I was going to go home because it was so difficult. That you don't know when you're going to eat, you don't know where you're going to sleep. It's very insecure. It feels really difficult. So I was thinking of going home. I was with another novice, and I said to him, thinking of going home, and he said that's fine if you want to go home. He said, but you haven't prayed about this. He said, go away and pray about it, and then tell me what you're going to do. Great spiritual advice, fantastic advice, bring it to God. So bring the mess to God effectively. And that's what I did that night. So I'm praying. We're in this church hall, and I was praying like I never prayed before, asking God to help me, directly with this issue about the fear of what's happening and help me get through these difficult situations, help us to get, food and accommodation and everything. And nothing dramatic happened, but very slowly I was able to overcome the fear, able to trust. And then things started to work out to my amazement. So obviously God was with me there in that situation, even though it wasn't obvious to me at the start. And I had to kind of pray. I had to ask for what I wanted, which is a very Ignatian thing. And also I had to pray with the problem. I often say to people, turn the problem into a prayer, ask God directly for help, and ask for God's grace directly with the issue that you face, whether it is, anger, frustration, difficulty. In my case, it was fear, so help me with the fear. So bring God's grace directly to bear on the problem, and that has a really powerful effect, and it kind of unlocks things for us, and it mobilizes things. I mean, we need a lot of humility to do that. Obviously, it's acknowledging that we are not God, for example, that we need help, and that, asking God to show up and show us the way. But that works, it works extraordinarily well. I found myself in that case. So that's what brought me back to the Camino then a number of years later when my brother had died. I wanted to help me work through this grief. Again, I got tremendous relief, and I got great insights. And my first book, Redemption Road, talks about that. So then every time I was in trouble, subsequently, I would go back on the Camino to get insights, to get to the bottom of things, to listen to God essentially. And the Camino always delivers, and God is always there. And sometimes we just need to create this silence and space in our lives in order to listen to that. I think that's what I would say.
So, Father, it's a very good explanation about, how to express, how to pray with God, with our own problems, instead of saying the formula there, but you know how to point out what is really happened to you. So I think this is very important, that for me and for others to know also that prayer is not only about formula. Of course, formula is needed, but what is really important to God to know is that to point what is really you experience there. So I think this is a very interesting topic, and Father, thank you. Uh, so, Father, it nowadays, no, based on what their experiences, and um, a lot of people experience of confusion, failure, or suffering, where they don't find God there, or somehow they blame God for it. Why I have to suffer this way? So, what kind of advice that you want to give that actually we can find God in the mess? So, what does they said, Father?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's one of the key things in the whole Christian life, obviously, and it's such a difficult issue about finding God in suffering. It's easy to find God. It's a nice day, everything's going really well, and I'm happy, and it's so easy to find God. But whenever you're in trouble and you're suffering and things are not going well, and it's really tempting to think that God has abandoned me, God has left me, is a very common thing. And it seems that way. It seems like that's the case, but it's only it only seems like that. It's only an apparent absence of God, we call it, in theology. So going back to the experience of the cross, especially Jesus on the cross, I find this really helpful. And you remember we're coming up to Holy Week and Lent and everything, so it's very, very relevant. So Jesus on the cross is suffering terribly, and he's trying to, be true to his mission, be true to what the Father has asked of him, and trying to pray his way through this really painful, extraordinarily difficult situation. And he's using the Psalms from the Old Testament. Do you remember this? He's praying with the Psalms, so he says, Lord, take this cup away from me. Not my will, but your will be done. And then he's saying, eventually he says, into your hands, Lord, I commend my spirit, which is another psalm. But before that, he says, Lord, why have you abandoned me? Remember that quote? Is a quote from Psalm 22, which is actually a psalm of trust, but he's tapping into that really human experience of feeling abandoned by God. And it's an extraordinary line in scripture. It really is extraordinary to think that Jesus has gone through this experience, the apparent absence of God, where God seems to be absent. But of course, we know from the story, the Bible, the resurrection is just around the corner, and Jesus manages to really connect very powerfully with God, and God is with him very powerfully in that moment. But he does it by praying the Psalms, obviously remaining faithful, but essentially he's praying with the problem. He's asking for the help that he needs, and he's giving everything over to God. Remember, into your hands, Lord, I commend my spirit. So what we have to do is to do the same thing that Jesus does. What does he do? He prays in difficulty. He asks God for help. He uses the Psalms. He uses everything he can to keep on track, to keep doing the right things, keep facing towards God, and keep asking for help. And eventually things swing around, because on the power of God and the power of the resurrection is always there. But to keep believing, and to keep on faith, and to keep praying. This is so difficult though when you're in a tough situation. So obviously I would say to people, just like that guy said to me on the Camino, you got to pray with this. You got to bring God into this. You got to ask God for help with the problem. You got to turn yourself towards God. You got to be humble. You got to hand everything over and ask God for every single help you can get. This is very challenging and very difficult, but it's very powerful, and it's real prayer. It's the real, authentic, genuine, the most kind of heartfelt prayer that there is. But it's so difficult to do, and it's so hard to remember when you're in the middle of it, to do that. So I would often say to people, you know, take a pause, try to stop, catastrophizing or doing the wrong things, and try to figure out what is God asking of you, what would be helpful to do, and how could you turn this into a prayer? How could you bring yourself back to God? So really difficult situations demand, some kind of exceptional prayer is what I would say to that.
So, Father, you mentioned about you underwent difficult situations because your brother, committed suicide, and then you felt like you were like in the dark. So, after the Camino, you experienced a lot of things. What was the most changed within you after this all experience of tough experience that you had,
Yeah,
Father?
sure. Yeah, so just to say that the Camino was like the last stage in a whole process of dealing with grief, I think is the most important thing. Like it took me about 7 years to work through the grief of losing my brother to suicide. It's a horrible experience. Nobody would ask for that, and it's really challenging and difficult, and it's so painful, and it tests every single aspect of yourself. So I was like tested right to the limit, and my Jesuit training obviously was the key thing. I remember I said earlier about keep doing the right things. So keep, praying, even though you don't feel like it. Remember, God is always there. So we have to keep putting ourselves with God and keep praying, keep showing up, and keep showing up for work. keep doing the good things is a kind of rule of thumb in Jesuit spirituality. You put the structures in place. It's not about the feelings. You put the structures, the processes, the rhythm, the timetable, and you so you keep show up for prayer, show up for work, and then you ask for help. Obviously, sometimes we need professional help in these situations, like really extreme situations. So I had to go for counseling, and I openly, say if you need help, you just go and get it. You ask for what you need. It takes a lot of humility, but that's what God is asking of us, to kind of be able to transform these situations, be able to move through them, not without pain and grief and difficulty, but there is a way through these situations. And often God is working powerfully with us and God is transforming us, from within. And that can be painful and difficult, but eventually we come out. So eventually I came to the point of realizing the end of the 7 years that the Camino would be a good thing. It just became really obvious to me. I remembered doing the that Camino in the novitiate. Remember as that experience we had way back. I was 1994, so I remembered that. So I thought I'm going to go back on the Camino again. It's going to be helpful. And I brought with me my brother's T-shirt, the only thing I had left of his, like a symbol. And again, we are people of symbols. This is the other Christian thing. We need concrete,
Mm-hmm.
tangible things. So I had the T-shirt, and then I had this ritual I wanted to do. I was going to bring the T-shirt to Santiago and put it on the altar as a kind of a symbol of my grief journey. And so I carried the T-shirt all the way along, got to Santiago, and I mean, after a lot of adventures and a lot of injury, as it turns out, and I eventually realized you can't just put things on the altar. Obviously, it's all cordoned off and everything. But I realized as a priest, I can get to the altar, during mass. So went to the sacristy and I showed I'm wearing my brother's t-shirt underneath my robes, and so I'm up on the altar. It's really emotional. I'm on the altar. We're saying mass. I'm celebrating the mass, and I'm saying the words from the second Eucharistic prayer. It talks about we remember our brothers and sisters who've fallen asleep with Christ. Huge moment. So then, I finish. I'm in Santiago, and it's a bit of an anticlimax, and I'm about to go home. And I went to it's called Finisterre, which is this town at the very end of the Camino, where the Camino meets the sea, about 90 kilometers from Santiago. I went with another Jesuit friend. I saw people burning their clothes, their hiking clothes, t-shirts and shorts and shoes even. You're not allowed to do this now, obviously, for ecological reasons. But back then, when I saw that, I suddenly, this really clear image came into my head that you have to burn. So you have to burn the t-shirt, your brother's t-shirt. Like, again, very painful process. That ritual I did first thing in the morning, fasting on my own on this rocky peninsula right on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. And again, it was very challenging. I mean, I was very upset. I was, shedding tears, but somehow God helped me through that. It was cathartic. I was able to move on. I was able to move beyond the guilt and the pain and the grief of everything. And I came home transformed. Like I was able to leave everything behind in Santiago. And that was one of the greatest kind of spiritual moments of my life. Being able to cooperate with what God was asking, be able to this ritual with the symbol in this particular place at the very end of the Camino, and that's what did it for me. So I always say to people that the Camino or even pilgrimage, you don't have to go to Spain, has a really powerful transformative effect if we can, listen to what God is saying and try to figure out what would be helpful for us to do. So yeah, that's the story of the grief and praying my way through that in the Camino.
Thank you very much, Father. In your Camino, so you definitely alone and can be loneliness. Oh, so can you explain a bit about alone and loneliness that can help people to get in touch with themselves and connect with God also at the same.
Yeah, that's a great question. So on the Camino, obviously you've got lots of time alone. You're walking, even though sometimes you meet other people and you might be with them for a while, but there's huge amounts of time on your own. And it sounds like it could be lonely, but it's again, it's a paradox. It's the most extraordinary experience of being with yourself, but being with God, obviously, and being in nature, I think is a huge part of that. You're in God's creation and you're moving as a pilgrim. So you're walking through, and that sense of movement is key. There's a purpose and there's a direction, and it's paradoxical. You're giving up the comforts. You're walking for hours on end. You're out in nature sometimes for 12, 14 hours a day. In the heat, sometimes thirst, sun, hunger, etc. But it is the most amazing experience of the presence of God. It's almost like a direct experience of the gospel. That's what the disciples did. Remember, they were sent out on pilgrimage. There's a huge history of Christian Catholic pilgrimage, obviously. And I would invite people to try this, just to get out and walk towards some kind of sacred or special site. In the beginning, it feels like nothing is happening, but eventually you step into this zone where you're in the moment. You feel God's presence. You have a sense of purpose. You can pray with whatever's going on in your life, and it's transformative. Like I said, it's happened to me numerous times. But we have to give up a lot. Give up comforts, giving up, sitting at home on the couch in order to do this one great thing. This walk towards God. I call it walking into God and leaving behind our own kind of ego or preconceptions or comforts, consumerism stuff, and just live a simple life. And that is really transformative. And I invite people to try that for themselves. It has the most extraordinary effect. You don't need to go to Spain for this. You just need a route and a place and an intention in your heart.
Well, Father, uh, back to religious life, because with a Jesuit, um, when feelings of loneliness arise in community life, or what spiritual practice can help to restore a sense of connection with God, oneself, and others. I think it's not only for the Jesuit, but for general, how people they
Yeah,
can connect again with God, Father.
sure. That's again a good question. I mean, I think loneliness is kind of part of human experience, and it happens to everybody, regardless. Even if you're in a family situation, or
Mm-hmm.
if you're working, living alone, whatever, living with other people, like loneliness can often happen. One of the key, again, the Jesuit insight is that the reflection, the awareness, just being able to identify what's happening. So just being able to look back, recognize what it is, and then to be able to do something about it. This is the discernment part. So discernment means just simply separating. Some things are good and from God, and we need to do those, and other things are not good and not from God. And sometimes loneliness can bring us to really difficult situations, in places like depression,
Mm-hmm.
like lack of hope, apathy. And that's the danger for us. Where is this bringing me? And then what can I do about it is the second question. How can I transform this? So as I said, that pilgrimage image is a really good example how I can transform it into something creative. But even if you're just still at home, obviously praying with it, just like I've said, pray with the problem. Ask for what you need, figure out what you need to do. Is this something that you're doing? Is it is there maybe you're spending too much time on social media, for example, watching television as life stopping, noticing what brings me life and what takes away life. This is the consolation and the desolation, obviously, technically, in the Jesuit speak. So trying to figure out what's happening and then trying to collaborate with the spirit, with what God is leading me to. God is always leading me to more life, to more connection, to more purpose and meaning, etc. So trying to tune into that. I mean, I'm getting caught up in discernment now, obviously, which is my other favorite topic. But this is key, noticing what's happening and then being able to act on it. We always have a choice about what we do and how we deal with things, and you know how we utilize the resources we have, for example, and how we can empower ourselves. But the other key thing I always recommend to people is the Ignatian or the Jesuit examen. That prayer at the end of the day. I normally recommend it. And my next book is about the examen. Actually, I'm not advertising it here, but I'm just saying it's so important, and it's such a simple little process, and it's just a reflection on the day. Remember I said earlier about we need to create a pause, a break in the day to be able to look back and see how we have been. So, I mean, there's 5 steps to it. The first one is just making a prayer, asking God for light, and that's connecting ourselves to God is a big thing. And then the second one is being grateful, noticing the gifts we've got during the day. And I always say to people, this is the most important step to connect yourself to gratitude, because ingratitude is so common and it's the default almost. Like often we've had a day and some things went badly. Maybe we focus on the negative and we end up in this kind of grumpy, unsatisfied, and maybe we're going to bed feeling like that. And that's called desolation in Jesuit language. And we're moving away from God and our true selves. So you've got to bring yourself back to gratitude, back to consolation. There's always gifts in every day, and you got to focus on that. And then we got to make those gifts happen more often, to live more in the gratitude and the consolation. So we got to go through our day then, which is the third step, which is separating, this is good, this is not good. How was I during the day and what happened without judging myself?
Mm-hmm.
The fourth step is then forgiving myself, for anything that's happened or where I haven't been connected, where I missed opportunities. And the fifth step is simply committing myself to live a better day. But that simple little process, the 5 step process, has an enormous impact. I find it keeps me on track. And obviously, they recommend it for Jesuits and for everybody. Keep yourself connected to God, notice what's happening, create a space in your life, and then choose better. Learn what's happening in your life. Notice where God is working. Notice where you're being distracted or being misled, and like choose better, live a better day, something like that.
Father, is there what attitudes that one has to do to prayer well, or to pray well? What attitudes that one has to cultivate, something?
Mm. Sure. Again, I always think sometimes it's not so much about trying to cultivating attitudes as just simply bringing myself to God exactly as I am, and obviously that it does take a little bit of humility, but it's not that humility is the goal. It's the goal is to get to God. The goal is to listen to what God is saying. Remember, God is always there, and God is always trying to communicate with us, and God uses everything to communicate with us. So, seemingly insignificant things like a song that I hear on the radio, you know, somebody says something in a conversation that strikes something. I see something, I have a memory that sparks. I have a dream, for example. Everybody's individual, and God works with people in a very personal way. And God is communicating with everybody personally and directly. This is the Ignatian presuppositions, from the spiritual exercises. And that's a really powerful thing, and it seems unbelievable, like why would God be interested in me? Why would God speak to me directly? And how, is it possible I could recognize God's voice? These are extraordinary things, but it's all true. But we have to kind of apply ourselves a little bit. We have to create a space, and we have to be a bit more discerning, and we have to create some openness. So I always say to people, you know, try to make a space, try to do the prayer and try to just improve it a little bit every time. You don't have to try any fancy techniques, or you don't have to be somebody else, or you don't have to try super hard. All you have to do is create a space, be open, and just attempt it. And God always kind of reaches out to us, and God always does the majority of the work. And our job is just to simply put ourselves in front of God, to be open, to be ready to listen, I would say.
So, can you share a bit about your own prayer? How do you pray, Father? Oh.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'll tell you a funny story. The first thing that I do in the morning, and this is something I learned from the Camino. The first thing I do is I just get out for a walk in the local park here. Remember that thing about contact with nature? And I find that sets up the day for me. And it's prayer, in the broadest sense. It's committing myself to understand that God is here, God is in my day, and no phone, right? Or no social media. That's a killer. If you start off with that, then that shapes your day. But we try to shape the day around God. So walking even for just 20 minutes, I find that has an enormous impact. And then I do morning prayer. Obviously, you know, often I do the prayer of the church, the office, or I do the reflection on the readings, or sometimes I just do silent prayer, just depending where I am, what seems to be working. Sometimes just using a mantra, a short phrase. Into your hands, Lord, I commend my spirit. I love that one. Or, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. The Jesus prayer. I find that really powerful. Simple, simple stuff. So then I obviously have mass during the day, and then I have the examen in the evening. Normally I try to do extended examen, just to spend time with God reflecting on things. So, you know, something around that. And then I try to get that Camino thing is like my retreat, for the summer, like a week on the Caminos, a week with God for me. Or so again, that's what I find to be helpful, what I've found helpful over the years. And then obviously I'll have spiritual direction as part of that. I would have journaling. I mean, a lot of other good things I would do, so something like that.
Hmm. That's a that's a very inspiring experience that I also need to learn from from you, that especially how to bring myself to God with all my limitations, my weakness, that one recognize that I am a sinner. So I think that's a really important for me too. And what message do you want to give to the young people who are longing to to search for meaning in life, search for God, or some even confusion about their faith? What wisdom do you want to give to them, Father?
Sure, I think the most important thing is to realize, you don't often hear this, but that we are created by God. We are part of God's creation. It's an extraordinary thing. And then the other thing, the Spirit lives within us. This is through our baptism, so that like God has already done this amazing work with us and creating us and making us who we are, and that God dwells, within us, within our humanity. So I don't have to be somebody else, don't have to be, perfect, or don't have to have everything worked out. That God understands, my flaws, weaknesses, and God still loves me, and God still works with me, and God is still trying to bring me somewhere. And yeah, just to believe that, and to live from that, and not to be caught up in, there's a lot of messages from the world, especially social media. You're not enough. You have to buy some other stuff to be perfect. You have to be perfect. You have to do things. You have to put on a face. You have to pretend. Like, don't listen to those false messages. And this is again basic discernment. Discernment means to separate. Remember, some things are good from God, and do those things, or other things are not good and not from God. You got to avoid those things. So that's the most important thing. Acting, taking responsibility for your life and acting in a way that's going to bring you close to God and bring you close to happiness. This is the other key thing, that there is a peace to be found. It's taken me a long time, I think, in my own life to find this. There is a peace to be found in being yourself, your real self, which is in God. I am a loved sinner, is the key Jesuit phrase, that God loves me. I'm flawed, but somehow God is miraculously working with me. And it's a kind of a prodigal son or a prodigal daughter message, that God is desperately trying to get in touch with me, waiting for me to come home, waiting for me to wake up to this reality that I am loved. I am a son or a daughter, and I deserve to be part of the family, and God is waiting to welcome me in. So some of those really powerful messages, but also realizing the fragility of life, the how difficult it is to keep on track. And yeah, so something around all of that, compassion for yourself, I say, was the other key thing. Understanding, compassion for others. Sometimes we get dealt a less than ideal hand in life. Sometimes our parents are not perfect. My parents certainly weren't perfect, and things happen to us in our lives, and we get hurt, and we get angry, we get damaged sometimes. So trying to pray with that and trying to keep on track and try not to be distracted. Getting help, I'd say, was the other key thing. Get the help you need. Try to put yourself around good people, good resources, a good frame of mind. Keep close to God. Keeping consolation is my other key phrase. Keeping consolation, keep living close to God. Keep doing the right things. Keep showing up for things, even though it doesn't feel great. Sometimes you keep doing the right things. Keep going to mass. Keep going to confession. Keep praying. Keep on track, and God will keep us right. And the feelings are not a good guide. Remember, that this is the modern world. Modern world says if it feels good to do it, but that's disastrous. I know in my own life it doesn't work. Whereas you have to say the feelings are not important. Sometimes they're positive and sometimes not. But the decisions that I make, trying to keep myself pointed towards the good and God, and that God somehow understands, and God somehow keeps on loving me through all of this and keeps bringing me to a good place.
Um, how to notice that the feeling is good and towards God, and the feeling is bad and leads me away from God. So how to notice that, Father?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, remember I said feelings can be deceptive sometimes, or they can go both ways, but there is, like, in consolation and desolation, or there are kind of emotional states, but they're not just about the feelings. They're about, is this a good thing in itself, and there is this thing about things are objectively good, like everything points to this being the right thing. Like sometimes I'm in a difficult situation and I need to do something, I need to make a decision. And sometimes it can be a really challenging decision. I was talking about when my brother died, I had to go to for counseling, for example. It's a really tough decision. Doesn't feel great, but objectively and discernment wise, it's actually a really good move. And other people will see that more clearly than I will. So having and we talk about spiritual direction in the Jesuit world, or guidance, having somebody that can help me to work through situations, being able to pray through that process. I talked about the discernment process, separate the feelings, like put them to one side for a bit and say, is this a good thing to do? And where is this bringing me to? How can I get back to peace and to balance and integrity? One of the big things, what's really going to help me? Everybody has difficult moments and everybody has challenges, but how we choose to deal with those things is one of the big challenges. God is always trying to help us and work with us and bring us to the best outcome. So tuning into those things, something like that.
So thank you very much, Father, for your time, your wisdom, your knowledge that has shared with me this night. So it very helpful for me, and I'm also grateful that I have you on my uh, podcast who can channel your knowledge to other people to learn and to come closer to God by your experience. So once again, thank you very much, Father. I continue to pray for one another, more successful, Father. Thank you, Father.
Amen. No, thank you so much. I love being on your podcast. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father.
And Bangladesh!